On the evening of February 16, 1978, Gardner Hathaway pulled his Chevrolet out of the American Embassy compound in Moscow and pointed it toward the apartment where he lived with his wife and 2 children in a neighborhood dominated by Soviet officials and carefully vetted diplomats. Hathaway was 47 years old, a career intelligence officer who had served in half a dozen foreign stations over 23 years, and he was currently the chief of the CIA's Moscow station, one of the most dangerous and frustrating postings in the entire agency. Moscow was what intelligence professionals called a denied area, a place where surveillance was constant, recruitment was nearly impossible, and even the simplest operations carried enormous risk. Hathaway had been in Moscow for 18 months, and in that time, he had managed to run exactly 0 successful intelligence operations against the Soviet military or political establishment. The KGB watched everything. They followed American diplomats from the moment they left the embassy until the moment they returned. They bugged apartments, tapped phone lines, and recruited informants from among the Soviet citizens who worked as drivers and maintenance staff and translators for the Americans. The CIA had tried for years to penetrate the Soviet system, to recruit sources inside the military-industrial complex or the Communist Party hierarchy, but every attempt had either failed or ended in disaster. Assets were arrested, officers were expelled, operations collapsed before they even began. And so Hathaway drove through the frozen Moscow streets on that February evening with the same weary resignation he felt most nights, thinking about reports he needed to file and cables he needed to send, and the general futility of trying to run espionage operations in a city where the KGB could watch your every move. He was stopped at a traffic light on Leninsky Prospect, a broad avenue lined with concrete apartment blocks that looked identical in the gathering darkness, when he heard a sound that didn't belong. A knock. 3 sharp raps on the driver's side window. Hathaway turned his head and saw a man standing on the curb beside his car. The man was wearing a dark coat and a wool hat pulled low over his ears, and his face was partially obscured by the shadows and the condensation on the window. But what Hathaway noticed immediately was that the man was holding something in his gloved hand, extending it toward the car, pressing it against the glass. It was an envelope, white, standard size, unmarked. The man's eyes met Hathaway's for perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, Hathaway understood exactly what was happening. This was a volunteer, someone attempting to make contact with American intelligence, someone taking an enormous risk by approaching a car with diplomatic plates in the middle of Moscow, where surveillance cameras and KGB watchers were everywhere. Hathaway's first instinct was to drive away. The CIA had been burned before by volunteers who turned out to be provocations, false flag operations run by the KGB to embarrass the Americans or to identify CIA officers operating under diplomatic cover. Volunteers were almost always traps. That was the conventional wisdom, the lesson learned from decades of failures and betrayals and operations that had gone catastrophically wrong. But something about this man's expression stopped Hathaway from putting the car in gear. It wasn't desperation exactly, and it wasn't fear, though there was probably some of both beneath the surface. It was determination. The look of someone who had made a decision and was going to see it through regardless of the consequences. The light changed from red to green. Cars behind Hathaway began to honk. The man tapped the envelope against the window one more time, more insistent now, and Hathaway made a choice that would set in motion one of the most important intelligence operations of the Cold War. He cracked the window open, just enough for the man to slide the envelope through, and then he drove away without looking back, his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to hurt, his mind already calculating what he had just done and what it might cost him if this turned out to be a setup. He didn't open the envelope immediately. He drove to his apartment, parked in the underground garage, and walked up 3 flights of stairs to the flat where his family was waiting. His wife asked how his day had been. He told her it was fine, nothing unusual, and he helped get the children ready for bed, while the envelope sat in his coat pocket like a piece of radioactive material. After everyone was asleep, Hathaway locked himself in the bathroom, the only room in the apartment where he felt reasonably certain there were no listening devices, and opened the envelope. Inside were several handwritten pages in Russian, neatly printed, dense with technical terminology and abbreviations that Hathaway couldn't fully decipher without a translator. But what he could understand, even with his limited technical knowledge, was that these pages appeared to contain information about Soviet military aviation systems, radar technology, and weapons development programs. The kind of information that should only exist inside classified research facilities, locked in safes, accessible only to engineers with the highest security clearances. The man on the street had not given Hathaway a vague offer to cooperate, or a request for money or asylum. He had given him actual intelligence, proof of access, a sample of what he could provide if the Americans were interested. And at the bottom of the last page, written in careful English, was a single sentence: "I will wait for your response at the same location in 2 weeks." Hathaway sat on the edge of the bathtub and stared at those pages for a long time, knowing that he was holding something that could either be the breakthrough the CIA had been desperately seeking for years, or the first move in an elaborate KGB game designed to compromise American intelligence operations in Moscow. The decision about what to do next wasn't his alone to make. He would have to send the documents back to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, where analysts and technical experts would examine every word, every detail, looking for signs of authenticity or deception. He would have to brief his superiors, submit reports, and wait for instructions. But sitting there in that bathroom in Moscow, with those pages in his hands, Gardner Hathaway understood that something had just changed. Someone inside the Soviet military establishment was reaching out to the Americans, offering to betray his country, and the question now was whether the CIA had the courage to take the risk. The documents were photographed, encrypted, and transmitted to Langley the next morning through secure channels. And over the following 48 hours, teams of specialists at CIA headquarters analyzed the contents with a level of scrutiny normally reserved for nuclear weapons intelligence. The conclusion came back cautiously optimistic. The information appeared genuine. The technical details matched what American intelligence knew about Soviet military programs, but included specifics that had never been seen before, specifics that suggested the author had direct access to classified research. But the CIA had been fooled before, and the leadership in Langley was deeply paranoid about Soviet deception operations. The decision was made to proceed, but slowly, carefully, with every possible precaution. Gardner Hathaway was instructed to return to the same location 2 weeks later and leave a response for the volunteer, a signal that the Americans were interested and wanted to establish a more secure method of communication. On the evening of March 2, 1978, Hathaway drove the same route he had taken on February 16th, and when he reached the traffic light on Leninsky Prospect, he slowed his car and casually tossed a small package out the window onto the curb, a package that contained instructions for how the volunteer should make contact again without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. The CIA was moving forward, but with extreme caution, aware that one mistake could cost not just the operation, but the life of the man who had knocked on Hathaway's window. What the CIA didn't know yet was the identity of the man who had approached Hathaway's car, or his motivations, or the extraordinary value of the intelligence he was prepared to provide. They didn't know that his name was Adolf Tolkachev, that he was 51 years old, that he worked as a senior engineer at a top-secret Soviet military research institute called Phasotron, and that he had access to some of the most closely guarded secrets in the Soviet defense establishment. They didn't know that Tolkachev had been planning his approach to American intelligence for more than a year, carefully watching, the patterns of diplomatic vehicles, studying the routes they traveled, waiting for the right moment to make contact. They didn't know that his motivation wasn't money or ideology in the abstract sense, but something far more personal: revenge. Adolf Tolkachev had grown up during the Stalin era, a time when millions of Soviet citizens were arrested, imprisoned, executed, or sent to labor camps in Siberia, on the flimsiest of pretexts, or no pretext at all. Tolkachev's wife, Natasha, had lost both of her parents to Stalin's purges. Her mother had been executed in 1938, accused of being an enemy of the state, a charge that was never substantiated and almost certainly false. Her father had been sent to a labor camp in the far north, where he died of exposure and malnutrition in 1941. Natasha had been just a child when her parents were taken, and she had grown up in a state orphanage, branded as the daughter of enemies, treated with suspicion and contempt by teachers and officials who believed that the sins of the parents could be inherited by their children. Tolkachev had married Natasha in 1950, and over the decades of their marriage, he had watched her carry the weight of that loss, the unresolved grief and anger over what had been done to her family. And as Tolkachev rose through the ranks of Soviet military engineering, working on projects that were supposed to strengthen the state that had destroyed his wife's parents, he began to feel a burning resentment toward the system he was serving. He read the works of dissidents like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov, writers who had dared to tell the truth about Soviet repression and brutality. He followed news of human rights abuses and political persecutions, and he came to the conclusion that the Soviet system was not just flawed, but fundamentally evil, built on lies and violence and the systematic crushing of human dignity. And so Tolkachev decided to do something about it. He decided to hurt the Soviet state in the most effective way he could, by giving its military secrets to its greatest enemy, the United States. It wasn't about defecting. Tolkachev had no interest in leaving the Soviet Union, no desire to abandon his wife and his son and start a new life in America. What he wanted was to inflict damage on the system from within, to undermine Soviet military power, to ensure that the billions of rubles spent on weapons research would be wasted because the Americans would know exactly what the Soviets were building and how to counter it. This was not a man acting on impulse or desperation. This was a man who had thought through his decision carefully, who understood the risks, and who had concluded that betraying his country was the only way to avenge the injustices committed against his family. The initial contact with Gardner Hathaway had been the result of months of preparation. Tolkachev had written and rewritten the documents he handed over, making sure they contained enough specific information to prove his access, but not so much that losing them would immediately compromise his position if the package was intercepted. He had chosen the location carefully, a spot where he could approach a diplomatic vehicle without being too obvious, where he could deliver the envelope and disappear into the crowd before KGB surveillance could react. And he had waited until the moment felt right, until the combination of courage and calculation aligned, and then he had stepped off the curb and knocked on the window. The CIA's response package that Hathaway tossed onto the street 2 weeks later contained instructions for a dead drop, a prearranged hiding spot where Tolkachev could leave materials and the CIA could retrieve them without any direct contact. It was a standard technique, designed to minimize risk, and the location chosen was a park on the outskirts of Moscow, a place with enough foot traffic to provide cover, but not so much that surveillance would be impossible to detect. Tolkachev followed the instructions exactly. On March 18, 1978, he walked to the designated park, located the specific tree that had been described in the CIA's message, and placed a small package wrapped in plastic inside a hollowed-out section of the trunk. The package contained more documents, more technical specifications, more proof that he was who he claimed to be, and that his access was genuine. CIA officers retrieved the package 2 days later, and when the materials were analyzed back at Langley, the conclusion was unanimous. This was real. This wasn't a provocation or a deception. This was an intelligence goldmine, a source with access to information about Soviet air defense systems, radar technology, and weapons programs that the United States had been trying to penetrate for decades. The decision was made to fully commit to the operation, to assign experienced case officers to handle Tolkachev, to provide him with the equipment and support he would need to continue passing intelligence without getting caught. But there was a problem. Tolkachev didn't want to use dead drops. He made this clear in a message he left in April, a handwritten note that expressed frustration with the impersonal nature of the system. Tolkachev wanted to meet his CIA handlers face to face. He wanted to talk to them, to ask questions, to receive instructions directly. He wanted, in short, to have the kind of relationship that was considered impossibly dangerous in Moscow, where every meeting carried the risk of KGB surveillance and arrest. The CIA's Moscow station was horrified. Face-to-face meetings with an agent in the middle of Moscow? It was insane. The KGB had eyes everywhere. They followed American diplomats constantly. They watched parks and restaurants and public spaces, looking for signs of espionage activity. A meeting between a CIA officer and a Soviet source would require creating what intelligence professionals called a gap, a window of time during which the officer could break free from KGB surveillance long enough to meet the agent and then return to surveillance without the KGB realizing anything had happened. These gaps were extraordinarily difficult to create and maintain, especially in a city as tightly controlled as Moscow. But Tolkachev was insistent. If the CIA wanted his intelligence, they would have to meet him in person. And the intelligence he was providing was so valuable, so unprecedented, that the CIA made the decision to accept the risk. Over the next several months, the Moscow station developed techniques for creating gaps and conducting brief meetings with Tolkachev on the streets of the city. These meetings were planned with obsessive attention to detail. CIA officers would leave the embassy in diplomatic vehicles, followed by KGB surveillance teams, and then execute complex maneuvers designed to temporarily shake the surveillance. A car would make a sudden turn into an alley. An officer would jump out and disappear into a crowded metro station. A duplicate vehicle would continue driving, creating the illusion that the surveillance target was still inside, while the actual officer was already blocks away, moving on foot to the pre-arranged meeting location. One technique that became famous within the CIA was the jack-in-the-box, a collapsible dummy designed to look like a person's torso and head, which could be hidden inside a bag or under a coat, and then quickly deployed to create the illusion that an officer was still sitting in the back seat of a car after he had actually exited. The dummy was crude, but in the brief moments when a KGB surveillance car was turning a corner or momentarily lost visual contact, it was convincing enough to buy the CIA officer a few critical minutes. Bill Plunkett, a CIA case officer who would become one of Tolkachev's primary handlers, later described a meeting that required him to use the jack-in-the-box technique. It was December 1982, and Tolkachev had requested an urgent meeting to pass along a large batch of documents. Plunkett and his wife left the American embassy with the station chief and his wife, ostensibly heading to a birthday party. The women were holding what appeared to be a decorated birthday cake, but the cake was actually the jack-in-the-box, disguised to look innocuous. KGB surveillance followed them as expected. When the car made a sharp turn onto a side street, creating a brief gap in visual contact, Plunkett jumped out, and his wife immediately deployed the dummy in his place, propping it up in the back seat so that from a distance, it looked like Plunkett was still in the car. The operation worked. Plunkett met Tolkachev for 20 minutes in a darkened courtyard, received the documents, and then reversed the process, jumping back into a different vehicle that picked him up at a pre-arranged location, while the jack-in-the-box continued to fool the KGB surveillance team for long enough that Plunkett was back under observation before anyone realized he had ever been gone. These meetings occurred approximately every 2 months for the next several years, and during those meetings, Tolkachev passed thousands of pages of classified documents to the CIA. He would photograph the documents at home using a miniature camera that the CIA had provided, a device no larger than a cigarette lighter, with specially designed film that could capture high-resolution images in low-light conditions. Tolkachev would stuff documents into his coat when he left work, claiming he needed to review them at home, and then he would spend hours photographing page after page in the small apartment he shared with Natasha and their teenage son, Oleg. The risk was enormous. If anyone discovered what he was doing, if a neighbor reported unusual activity, if his son accidentally saw the camera or the film, if a security officer at Fazotron noticed that documents were being checked out more frequently than usual, Tolkachev would be arrested, interrogated, and almost certainly executed. Soviet law classified espionage as treason, and the penalty for treason was death. But Tolkachev was meticulous. He varied his routines. He never took the same documents twice in a row. He developed excuses for why he needed to review materials at home, claiming he worked better in quiet environments, claiming he wanted to make notes for presentations, claiming anything that would explain his behavior without raising suspicion. And the intelligence he provided was staggering. The CIA learned details about Soviet air-to-air missiles, including the R-23, R-24, R-27, R-33, and R-60 systems. They learned about fighter aircraft avionics, including the radar systems used in the MiG-29 Fulcrum, the MiG-31 Foxhound, and the Su-27 Flanker, aircraft that were among the most advanced in the Soviet arsenal. They learned about the S-300 surface-to-air missile defense system, a long-range weapon designed to shoot down American bombers and cruise missiles. The information Tolkachev provided allowed American military engineers to design countermeasures, to develop electronic warfare systems that could jam Soviet radar, to build aircraft that could evade Soviet missiles. In 1979, just 1 year after Tolkachev's initial contact, the U.S. Air Force estimated that his intelligence had already saved the United States approximately $2 billion in research and development costs. Projects that would have required years of testing and analysis were completed in months because Tolkachev had given the Americans a complete blueprint of Soviet capabilities. And yet, despite the enormous value of his intelligence, Tolkachev asked for very little in return. He refused large payments. He told his CIA handlers that he didn't need money, that his salary as a senior engineer was sufficient for his family's needs. What he wanted was Western music, records and tapes by the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, artists whose music was difficult or impossible to obtain in the Soviet Union. He wanted art supplies for his son, Oleg, who was studying architecture and needed high-quality pencils and paper. He wanted a Sony Walkman, the portable cassette player that had become a symbol of Western consumer culture. And he wanted one other thing: a suicide pill. Tolkachev was under no illusions about what would happen if he was caught. He had seen what the KGB did to people accused of espionage, the show trials, the forced confessions, the public executions. He did not want to endure that. If he was arrested, he wanted a way to end his life quickly, before the interrogations began, before he could be broken and forced to reveal information that might compromise other operations or endanger his family. The CIA hated providing suicide pills. They called them L-pills, and they represented everything dark and tragic about espionage. Giving an agent a suicide pill was an acknowledgement that the operation might end in death, that the person risking everything for you might one day face a choice between captivity and oblivion. It was a psychological burden that no case officer wanted to carry. But Tolkachev insisted, and after much internal debate, the CIA agreed. They provided him with a small capsule containing potassium cyanide, concealed inside a fountain pen that Tolkachev could carry with him at all times. If he was ever cornered, if he was ever certain that arrest was imminent, He could bite down on the capsule, and death would come within seconds. For 7 years, from 1978 to 1985, the operation continued successfully. Tolkachev met with his CIA handlers 21 times, always in Moscow, always under the nose of the KGB, always with the understanding that one mistake could mean the end. He became known within the CIA as CK Sphere, his operational codename, though his handlers privately referred to him as the billion-dollar spy, a nickname that acknowledged the extraordinary value of his contributions. But nothing lasts forever. And in 1985, the operation began to unravel. On June 13, 1985, a CIA officer named Paul Stambaugh drove to a prearranged meeting location in Moscow, intending to meet Tolkachev and collect another batch of documents. Stambaugh was relatively new to Moscow, having been assigned to the station only a few months earlier, and this was one of his first operational meetings. He followed the standard protocols, executed the maneuvers designed to create a gap in KGB surveillance, and arrived at the meeting location at the designated time. And that's when everything went wrong. More than a dozen KGB officers were waiting for him. They surrounded his car before he could react, pulled him out, and arrested him on the spot. Stambaugh was carrying a package intended for Tolkachev, a package that contained miniature cameras, rubles, and Western art supplies, everything needed to prove that he was engaged in espionage. Hiwa was taken to Lubyanka, the infamous KGB headquarters and prison in central Moscow, and interrogated for hours. Stambaugh gave them nothing. He invoked his diplomatic immunity, refused to answer questions, and insisted that he was a legitimate diplomat who had done nothing wrong. The KGB eventually released him and expelled him from the Soviet Union, but the damage was done. The KGB now knew that Tolkachev had been working for the CIA. And 11 days later, on June 24, 1985, Adolf Tolkachev was arrested. The arrest happened while Tolkachev was driving back to Moscow from a dacha in the countryside where he and Natasha had spent the weekend. KGB officers, including members of the elite Alpha Group Spetsnaz unit, surrounded his car on the highway and forced him to pull over. Tolkachev reached for the fountain pen that contained the L-pill, but the KGB officers moved too quickly. They dragged him out of the car, stripped him, and searched him before he could activate the capsule. The thing Tolkachev had feared most, the scenario he had prepared for with the suicide pill, was now happening, and he had been denied even the dignity of choosing how it would end. Tolkachev was taken to Lubyanka and interrogated for months. The KGB wanted to know everything: how long he had been spying, what information he had passed, how the CIA had recruited him, whether there were other Soviet citizens involved. Tolkachev eventually confessed, though accounts differ on whether the confession was voluntary or coerced. He admitted to photographing thousands of pages of classified documents over 7 years. He admitted to meeting with CIA officers 21 times. He admitted to betraying his country in service of a foreign power. In September 1985, Tolkachev was tried in a closed military tribunal. The trial lasted less than a day. He was found guilty of treason under Soviet law, and the sentence was mandatory: death by firing squad. On September 24, 1986, Adolf Tolkachev was executed at a facility outside Moscow. He was 59 years old. His wife, Natasha, and his son, Oleg, were not arrested or punished, which suggests that Tolkachev had successfully kept his espionage activities completely separate from his family life. Neither of them had known what he was doing. They had simply believed he was a loyal Soviet engineer, working long hours on important projects. The question that haunted the CIA after Tolkachev's arrest was how the KGB had discovered him. And the answer, when it finally emerged, was worse than anyone had imagined. Tolkachev had not been caught because of a mistake he made. He had not been betrayed by faulty tradecraft or surveillance technology. He had been betrayed by Americans. 2 of them. Edward Lee Howard was a former CIA officer who had been slated for assignment to the Moscow station, but was fired in 1983 after failing a polygraph examination and admitting to drug use and petty theft. Howard was bitter about his dismissal, and in 1984 he made contact with the KGB and began selling them information about CIA operations, including details about a highly valuable source in Moscow. Howard fled to the Soviet Union in 1985, just months before Tolkachev's arrest. The second traitor was Aldrich Ames, a CIA counterintelligence officer who had access to nearly every classified operation the agency was running against the Soviet Union. Ames began spying for the KGB in April 1985, motivated entirely by money and willing to sell out anyone and everyone to get it. He provided the Soviets with the names of multiple CIA assets, including Tolkachev, and those betrayals led directly to arrests and executions. Ames was not caught until 1994, nearly a decade after he began his treachery, and by that time, the damage he had caused was incalculable. Tolkachev's arrest was part of a broader catastrophe that saw at least 10 CIA sources in the Soviet Union compromised and executed between 1985 and 1986, all because two Americans had chosen personal gain over loyalty. Today, a painting of Adolf Tolkachev hangs in the lobby of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. It's a portrait of a man in a dark suit and glasses, a man who looks unremarkable, ordinary, like an engineer you might pass on the street without noticing. But that unremarkable man was one of the most valuable intelligence assets the United States ever had during the Cold War, a man who risked everything to hurt the system that had destroyed his family, a man who succeeded for 7 years in doing something that should have been impossible, and a man who ultimately paid the price for his courage. His son, Oleg, survived and became an architect, living a quiet life, apparently unaware for years of what his father had done. Whether Oleg knows now, whether he understands the full scope of his father's actions, is unclear. The story of Adolf Tolkachev raises questions that have no easy answers. Was he a hero or a traitor? Was his espionage justified by the injustices committed by the Soviet state? Or was it simply betrayal dressed up in the language of revenge? Was the CIA right to run an operation that put Tolkachev's life at such extraordinary risk? Or should they have refused his offer and sent him away to live in safety? The truth is probably that all of these things are true simultaneously. Tolkachev was a man who made a choice born of anger and grief and a desire to strike back at a system he believed was evil. The CIA used him because his intelligence was too valuable to ignore, even though they knew the operation might end in his death. And when the end came, it came not because of anything Tolkachev did wrong, but because the CIA itself was compromised, because the Americans he was helping had betrayed him. The Cold War is over now. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 5 years after Tolkachev's execution. The KGB was disbanded and replaced by new intelligence services. The secrets Tolkachev died protecting are no longer secret. The radar systems and missiles he provided information about are obsolete, replaced by new technologies that neither side could have imagined in the 1980s. But the story of Adolf Tolkachev endures because it represents something larger than any single operation or any specific intelligence coup. It represents the human cost of espionage, the choices people make when they are caught between loyalty and conscience, between safety and principle, between living quietly and taking a stand. Tolkachev knocked on the window of a CIA officer's car on a cold February evening in Moscow, and that single act set in motion events that would save the United States billions of dollars, that would shift the balance of power in the Cold War, and that would ultimately cost him his life. He knew the risks, he understood the consequences, and he did it anyway, because he believed that some things were worth dying for. Whether history will remember him as a hero or a traitor depends on which side you stood on during the Cold War. But what is undeniable is that he was a man who made a choice, who lived with that choice for 7 years, and who faced the consequences of that choice with a courage that few people could muster. And in the end, that is what makes his story worth telling. Not the intelligence he provided, not the money he saved the United States, but the fact that one man, armed with nothing but a camera and a determination to strike back at injustice, managed to operate successfully in the heart of one of the most repressive surveillance states in history. The KGB had thousands of officers. They had cameras and bugs and informants and satellites. They had the power to arrest anyone, to interrogate anyone, to execute anyone. But for 7 years, they could not stop Adolf Tolkachev. And that, more than anything else, is the measure of what one person can accomplish when they decide that silence is more dangerous than action.